Hey everyone! Many of you have probably heard of John Wayne Gacy, even if you aren't too familiar with true crime. But have you heard of Dean Corll, aka the Candyman? He was also known as the Pied Piper. Like Gacy, he lured teen boys to their deaths. There is a 2021 miniseries on the Discovery Plus channel of Amazon Prime called The Clown and the Candyman. It's about Gacy and Corll and theorizes that they might have had ties to a dark underground ring involving young boys. The documentary begins with a Corll case, and I'm just going to give an overview to give you an idea of what went down. The police were first informed about Corll's crimes when they were called to his home in August 1973. There were 3 teens there named Elmer Wayne Henley, interestingly had the same middle name as Gacy, Tim Curley, and Rhonda Williams. 17-year-old Henley confessed to shooting his friend Dean Corll, but claimed it was in self-defense. At the home, the police found items used to restrain the boys, marijuana, etc. Corll was 33 at the time, and he was a lineman at the Lighting and Power Company in Houston. He was also known as the Candyman because his mother owned a candy factory, and he was known for handing out candy to kids and letting them play pool in the back room of the factory, and generally being a really pleasant and likable guy. But apparently he had a hidden self that was far darker than anyone could imagine. Henley informed the police that Corll was guilty of murdering several teen boys over the years and burying them in a boat shed. Personally, I find a grown man acting friendly with teen boys, giving them motorcycle rides, etc., to be a huge red flag. But people didn't pick up on it back then. 17 bodies were ultimately found in the boat shed, and they had to be identified through clothing because this was the 70s. It is revealed that Henley was paid by Corll to find boys and to help the older man kill and dispose of them. But that's not the end of the story. Another young man named David Brooks comes forward. He's 18 now. He says that Henley was not just an innocent bystander and was involved in this in more ways than he's admitting. He says there are more bodies near Lake Sam Rayburn. Brooks had helped Corll out in the past as well, though he was married with a kid now and was trying to move on from that. He had been groomed by Corll from a young age, and had seen him as a father figure. This is something I've noticed time and again, where grown men prey on kids who come from broken homes, and that was the case with both Brooks and later Henley. The documentary goes into a little bit of detail about the fact that Henley was luring friends to their deaths, not just necessarily strangers, and that's what makes this even more horrific. Henley was actually a boy that Brooks lured to Corll, but instead of becoming a victim, he was ultimately turned into an accomplice. The documentary then goes into a little bit of Corll's history. For example, he played trombone as a kid. He was later in the U.S. Army and was an expert in radio operations, whatever that means. He was honorably discharged in 1965 after being there for not even quite yet a year. He then helped his mother with her business and became known locally as the Candyman. Everyone seemed to love him. For example, the mothers of Brooks and Henley knew him and were allegedly supportive of his relationship with their sons. However, Corll's own stepfather had suspicions about him and told his mother that he thought the young man might be a homosexual. Corll's mother was upset by that insinuation and ended up divorcing the man and moving away. But Corll stayed behind. And it is stated that while alone in his own apartment, things started going downhill for him in a sinister way. Skip Hollandsworth, a true crime writer for Texas Monthly, is one of the people interviewed here. Also interviewed are Ben Winkle, brother of victim Mally Winkle, and a man named Bernie Milligan, who had 2 close encounters with Dean Corll, one in 1969 and one just a month before Corll's death in 1973. I'm not going to go into detail about what was done to the boys, but I will say that Corll was clearly a sadist. You'll notice that I kind of glossed over some of the things that the police found at his place. That's because I don't want to go into the morbid details. Certainly there are places you can go to find this information. For instance, I used Wikipedia as well for information in addition to the documentary. So Wikipedia is one place, the documentary is another, just 2 of the places you can go. I just don't feel comfortable going into the details. You know, it's a very sick case. The facts just kind of stick in your mind when you hear them, and it's particularly dark, and I just don't want to go there. All in all, Corll killed somewhere around 27, 28 boys. I think I've read different numbers in different places, but it was something around there, just shy of 30. There could be more. It's very possible there could be more, but from what I know, there have been 27 or 28 that have been linked to him. So many boys from one area went missing due to Corll and his accomplices that there were actually a couple of sets of brothers in there who were both killed by Corll, and that stuck out to me as well, the fact that there were families who lost 2 boys to this monster. Most were found in the boat shed. There were about 4 that were found near Lake Rayburn, and there were a couple of other locations where bodies were found. It is stated in the documentary that there were more than 400 kids who went missing in that area between 1971 to 1973. The police assumed the boys were runaways. For example, one of the first victims, a 14-year-old named Jimmy Glass, had run away once before, so when he disappeared while leaving church one day, they just assumed he'd run away again. I'm sure they assumed these boys were runaways even when it didn't make sense to assume that. For example, 2 boys who disappeared were last seen heading out for a swim. Skip mentions that Corll would play a game where he would handcuff the boys and then see how fast they could take off the handcuffs. And this was just a ruse, of course, to get handcuffs on them. It is mentioned in the documentary that David Brooks was convicted of a single murder, that of 15-year-old Billy Ray Lawrence, and received life for that. Henley was also convicted and received a life sentence. I confirmed that on Wikipedia because I can't remember if that was mentioned. I'm sure that was mentioned in the documentary. If so, I missed it. Now the documentary skips ahead to November 2006. There are still unidentified bodies. Dr. Sharon Derrick takes over the case in the medical examiner office in Houston because she wants, to help bring these boys home to their families. She sees 3 boxes from the Houston mass murders, and her interest is piqued. She's identified 5 more victims since 2006, but as of now, from what I'm reading online, there's still 1 unidentified boy left. I'm not finding anything online about his identity having been discovered yet. The documentary does mention the possibility that he could have been a young boy named Bobby French. Now the documentary moves on to Gacy, who is 1,000 miles away in Chicago. He comes to the police's attention in December 1978 when a 15-year-old pharmacy stock boy named Robert Peast goes missing after telling his mother that he's going to go talk to a contractor about a potential job opportunity. It's his mother's birthday, so for him to just walk off and not return is out of character. The police are given Gacy's name as a potential suspect, and they discover he's an ex-con with a history of offenses involving young boys, so they decide this makes him a very viable lead, and they go to talk to him. But they don't have a search warrant at first. They eventually do get one. The police could tell Gacy was a weirdo from his decor. Personally, from the photo I saw of his hallway, it looked like the inside of a funhouse. Maybe that was what he was going for. He had clown pictures on the walls of his bedroom. Surprise, surprise, he was, after all, the guy who dressed as Pogo the Clown for the amusement of sick kids in the hospital. He was overall thought to be an upstanding guy who was involved in the community and politics. Certainly, nobody involved in politics could be hiding bodies in their basement. He was also a twice-divorced father of 2. The police find lots of concerning stuff in his place, such as handcuffs and tons of police badges, along with jewelry, IDs, and licenses that appeared to maybe belong to some of the victims. They're led to one particular victim by a school ring with the initials JAS engraved on it. John Zick was a missing 19-year-old. The police discover that many of Gacy's former employees are missing. The police decide to track him to make sure he doesn't destroy evidence, and they witness him scoping out a guy on the street one night. They just get this feeling he wants to do something, but can't because he knows the police are watching him. To the police, he is very friendly and cooperative, but a bit of a braggart, to put it lightly. The sister of victim Gregory Godzik is interviewed, and she talks about how excited her brother was to be offered a job making good money. She said her mother wasn't happy about the idea of Gregory working for this guy, but ultimately, Gregory, like the members of Fleetwood Mac, went his own way. Gregory Godzik would later be one of the confirmed victims, but as of the airing of this miniseries, there were still some unidentified victims. As of 2023, based on my online research, it looks like 5 still remain unidentified. While talking to 2 of Gacy's employees, Mike Rossi and David Cram, who also lived with Gacy for a period of time, the police find out that these 2 men had been digging in Gacy's basement crawl space due to an alleged sewage issue, so that might be a pretty good place to start looking for bodies. They eventually pull Gacy over. All they can charge him with at that point is possessing marijuana and giving it to a gas station attendant, but they do eventually find bodies in the basement, and Gacy, concerned about his precious rug, offers to draw them a map to facilitate the process. He probably figures he's already done for. He claims his first victim was killed in self-defense. I don't think that means much when he went out of his way to conceal the death and when there were over 30 more that followed that one. There were also 4 bodies that were thrown into the river. One of them was Rob Peast, and he was eventually found as well. So there were 29 victims in the house and 4 in the river that we know of. Apparently, Gacy liked to cruise, looking for victims and pretending to be a cop. He used Corll's handcuff trick. According to the documentary, Gacy claimed to be inspired by Corll and was proud to have a higher body count than him. You know, serial killer goals. He also used a defense of insanity, claiming to have a second identity, but he was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death. Some other things we learn is that Gacy is an artist, and in conversations he had with some true crime researcher named Randy White in the late 80s, early 90s, Gacy mentioned a man named John David Norman who was busted for trafficking boys in Dallas in the 70s before being released on bond and relocating to Illinois under a new identity. Gacy actually had a connection to a man named Philip Paskey, who was associated with John David Norman and was also a former employee of Gacy's. Could Gacy have had accomplices? And was Corll connected to this ring as well, since Henley did mention at one point that Corll claimed to be involved with some organization that was trafficking young boys? Personally, I find it hard to watch documentaries about underground rings of this kind. It's scary to hear that there were lots of men of authority who were entangled in this, but it's not surprising, and personally, I found the stories of the victims more worthwhile. We get to hear from another woman whose brother, Andy Drath, went missing as a teen. He is later identified through DNA as a dead young man found in San Francisco, so his killer is unknown, but it was stated that he was a witness against his abusive foster parents. It's possible his death could be connected to the ring, but it's still unsolved as of the documentary's airing. So I won't go into any more details. You can watch this mini-series on Discovery Plus. I watched it on my add-on Amazon Prime channel. I hope you all have a good night, and I hope I didn't give you nightmares. These are definitely a couple of unsettling cases, not to mention the John David Norman connection. Take care, everyone.